thing you'd want to find while isolated out in space is an air leak.
Or rogue space junk.
Malfunctions in your spacesuit.
But all of this happened and more. On June 6th of 2018, the Soyuz MS-10 mission launched with 3 astronauts aboard, a Russian commander, an American astronaut, and a German flight engineer. That sounds like the start to a joke, but they were headed to the International Space Station. Now, for a few months, everything went smoothly, but then something unexpected happened. On August 29th, the crew received an urgent message from Mission Control. They detected a small drop in air pressure on board. The crew was mortified by what they found. There was a tiny 2mm hole in the orbital module. Luckily, the crew was able to seal it back up, and the air pressure stabilized again, but there were a lot of questions. Primarily, how did this hole get there? The situation got even more complicated when it was discovered that the hole had been covered up with a poor quality patch and appeared to have been drilled. Russian officials started to suspect that the hole might have been caused by sabotage. They even accused NASA of deliberately trying to harm the mission. Some theories suggested that the hole was drilled from inside the module, leading to speculation that one of the crew members might have done it themselves. There was even a sensational claim from a Russian tabloid that the American astronaut on board had created the hole because of a personal dispute with another crew member, which NASA said was completely ridiculous. To this day, though, it's still a complete mystery as to what actually happened.
You know what you really don't want to find while floating on a 460-ton piece of metal, floating 408 kilometers away from Earth in the vacuum of space? A chip in the windshield. Well, not exactly the windshield, but the cupola, which is like a dome-shaped observatory made up of primarily windows, one of which has a chip in it. That's not good, especially considering the fact that the cupola is where the astronauts aboard the ISS operate the space station's robotic arms, meaning they spend quite a lot of time in there. And there's a chip in one of the windows, which were all built with some of the strongest materials known to man. I'm talking fused silica and quartz sand melted together by electrical fusion and borosilicate glass, the most thermal shock resistant glass in the world. But of course, all of that was no match for a small piece of space debris, likely measuring in at a few thousandths of a millimeter, that collided with the glass pane at a speed of, in scientific terms, super duper fast. And these super fast debris are everywhere. In fact, there are more than 20,000 pieces of orbital debris larger than 10 centimeters that can currently be tracked by ground radar, and 10 centimeters is a hell of a lot bigger than whatever hit the cupola on the ISS. Now, imagine you're an astronaut out on a spacewalk and one of these 10-centimeter guys comes whizzing towards you. I hate to say it, but I'm pretty sure that would be the last thing you would ever see. Although it would probably be going so fast that you wouldn't actually get to see it, but you know what I mean.
Speaking of debris, here's something you wouldn't want to see flying at you in space: pieces of an exploded satellite. But that's exactly what happened to astronauts aboard the ISS in 2021. The Cosmos 1408 was a Soviet satellite launched in 1982. After a few years of operation, it became inactive, but continued to orbit Earth. In 2021, Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon that destroyed Cosmos 1408. This caused a huge cloud of debris to spread out in space. At the time, there were 7 astronauts on board the ISS, and this cloud of debris was intersecting with its orbit every 93 minutes. To keep everyone safe, Mission Control told the astronauts to put on their spacesuits and get into the escape capsules just in case any of the debris hit the space station and caused damage. Luckily, the debris didn't end up colliding with them, but this was a pretty close call. Over time, most of the junk is dispersed, leaving about 300 pieces of the original 1800 still in orbit.
Another terrifying thing to discover is the fact that you can literally drown in space. On July 16th of 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano almost drowned while out on a spacewalk after a leak caused his helmet to fill with water. According to NASA officials, contamination had caused a blockage in a fan pump, which in turn caused water to back up into the astronaut's helmet. If that wasn't bad enough, according to reports, space station management had actually known about the leak a week before and still gave Parmitano the go-ahead for the spacewalk, which is crazy. Oh, but that's not all, as it wasn't long into Parmitano's spacewalk that he reported the water in his helmet, and yet it took mission control an hour and a half to give the okay for Parmitano to come back inside, at which point his helmet was half full of water which had soaked into his visor and earbuds, rendering him essentially momentarily blind and deaf. Because of this, he had to enter the airlock and prepare for repressurization using only muscle memory and feel. Luckily he made it, but it was a pretty close call.
In December of 2022, there was a coolant leak on a Russian craft docked at the ISS. The leak happened just before a planned spacewalk by 2 Russian cosmonauts. The Russian Space Agency decided the best option was to send a new, empty Soyuz spacecraft called MS-23 to replace the damaged one, MS-22. Now, MS-22 would be sent back to Earth for inspection. Normally, Soyuz missions are launched every 6 months. This meant the new Soyuz crew for MS-23 wasn't fully trained yet, so they had to wait until another spacecraft, MS-24, was ready in September to take the new crew to the ISS. Once this new crew finally arrived, the astronauts returned to Earth in the new craft. In the end, they'd been stuck on the ISS for 12 months instead of the 6 that they'd originally been planning for.
Radiation levels are pretty scary in space. In fact, radiation aboard the ISS is so intense, the astronauts stationed there are classified as radiation workers, as just 1 day aboard the ISS is equivalent to roughly 4 months of typical background radiation in the UK. Keep in mind, Europe is one of the top 3 countries when it comes to high levels of background radiation, so that's not good. And the levels experienced inside of the ISS are nothing compared to the ones on the outside, the ones experienced by astronauts who are required to step out of the ISS for a spacewalk mission. The radiation comes from 2 sources: energetic particles from the sun, which become more prevalent during times of high solar activity, and galactic cosmic rays. In order to protect against these rays and particles, the dormitories of the ISS are coated in polyethylene plastic, which, believe it or not, actually works better to block out radiation than metal, but that's mainly because metal can trigger secondary particle showers, and no one wants that.
Not every trip to the International Space Station is a success. On October 11th, 2018, the Soyuz MS-10 spacecraft launched with 2 crew members, a Russian cosmonaut named Alexei Ovchinin and NASA astronaut Nick Hague. Just a little over 2 minutes into the flight, the crew started feeling weightless. It turned out that there was a problem with the rocket's boosters. Normally, the rocket's first and second stages separate during ascent to get the spacecraft into orbit, but one of the 4 boosters hadn't detached properly. Luckily, the spacecraft has a launch escape system. The system is designed to quickly push the crew capsule away from the rocket if something goes wrong. In this case, it worked as intended, and the capsule was safely separated from the malfunctioning rocket. That capsule then started its descent back to Earth, but the descent was much steeper than usual, and the crew experienced about 7 times the force of Earth's gravity, which is awful to think about. That must have felt like being buried alive by air, especially right after having felt weightless. Terrible. The capsule landed safely in Kazakhstan though, and the 2 were okay. But just goes to show how easily things can go wrong when it comes to space missions.
You know what's not necessarily terrifying in a you might lose your life kind of way, but more so in a you might lose your lunch kind of way? The fact that astronauts routinely drink their own pee. Yellow snow has nothing on them. Basically, because the ISS is so far away from Earth and transporting supplies, even necessary supplies like fresh water, is both difficult and expensive, the great minds at NASA came up for a way for pee to be filtered into drinking water. It's both as gross and not as gross as it sounds. When an astronaut pees in space, a vacuum sucks up all of that liquid so that it can be distilled through a process called the urine process assembly, which separates the water from the waste, leaving behind something called a urine brine, and producing fresh, albeit pretty gross to think about, drinking water.
Sticking with the bathroom theme, let's talk about the time the toilet leaked on the ISS. The bathroom is always a concern when traveling, right? I mean, what's the bathroom situation going to be like in this grimy motel room? Yikes, I don't want to sit on that. People end up in places across the globe, sometimes having no idea how the toilets even work. People are very particular about their bathroom situations. But for how confusing and stressful going to the bathroom can be outside of your own home, But here on Earth, imagine going to the bathroom so far from home you're not even on the surface of the planet anymore. And to make matters worse, there's no gravity. Yeah, it's a lot to deal with, but things got even worse in 2019 when the astronauts aboard the ISS were working on upgrading their toilet. The old toilet had been installed way back in 2008 and was starting to show its age. They were replacing it with a new universal waste management system, which was supposed to be more modern, cleaner, efficient. While installing the new toilet though, one of the water pipes developed a leak, which caused about 2.5 gallons of water to start flowing about the station. The astronauts then had to collect all of this floating water. But I mean, they were lucky that this happened while they were installing the toilet and not after it had been used for the first time.
So there's terrifying and there's age-defying. Allow me to explain. Astronauts aboard the ISS experience something called relative velocity time dilation, which basically means time moves slower for them because of the speed in which they are orbiting Earth. While this may sound amazing, revolutionary, and a great way to stay away from Botox and facelifts, it's unfortunately not that impressive. I mean, it's incredibly cool to think that technically the ISS crew is aging slower than either you or I, but it's significantly less cool when you take into consideration the fact that after 6 months aboard the ISS, astronauts are only 0.005 seconds younger than they would be if they had just stayed on Earth. I'm sure one day rich people will figure out a way to double down on that speed and use this concept to their wrinkleless benefit, but until then, this is what we've got.
All right, with all that said, folks, we are going to catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.
Stay space out there.